Professor Heather Andrea Williams, in 1863, what was generally the slave population in the U.S.?
Probably about 5 million in the American South at that point. Slavery had been abolished in northern states, and I think it's important to say that just because many people don't realize there had been slavery in the North. But by the 1820s, it had been abolished in places like New York and Massachusetts. And so slavery then continued in the South, and there were about 5 million.
Of those 5 million, how many do you think were displaced from their families?
Oh, it's so difficult for me to speak in terms of numbers. It really is, because I get bits and pieces of information, and part of the point of the work that I do is that nobody was really keeping track of these people. And so in the work that I've done, I point out that not everybody experienced separation, not every enslaved person, but large numbers of them did. But I can't say if most of them did or if a third of them did. Michael Tadman, who's a geographer, has estimated that about a third of enslaved children experienced separation of some sort. So maybe they were sold away from their parents, or one or the other parent was sold away. So he estimates that about 1 million children, 1 million people were taken from the Upper South to the Lower South as part of a domestic slave trade. But as to how many of them had family disruptions, it's really hard to figure out the precise numbers. So I kind of try to stay away from them. I just know that a lot of people experience separation. And you might go with your mother if you were a child, but you might be leaving your father behind, or your father may have been sold before, or you may be leaving your grandparents behind. And so disruption happened in a lot of different ways.
In your most recent book, Help Me to Find My People, where did the title come from?
It comes from an ad that people placed ads in newspapers following the Civil War. So the Civil War ended 1865, April 1865, and by October of 1865, you start to see these ads that people are placing in newspapers looking for family members. And they kept placing these ads, various people, up until about 1903 is the last date that I can find an ad. And so this is language from one of them.
And here is this ad. I don't know if you can see this
Yes.
at all. Can you read that?
I don't know if I can read it from over there, but it's written by, it was placed by Thornton Copeland, and it was in the Nashville, the Colored Tennessean out of Nashville, Tennessee, and it appeared in, I think, October of 1865. And I'm going to try to read it. I'm old. It says, "Information is wanted of my mother, whom I left in Fauquier County, Virginia, in 1841. I think I need to have it closer to me to read it.
Okay, well,
Is that possible?
that just gives you an indication of what it says.
So he placed this ad in 1865, and I think it's 1844, if I'm remembering the ad correctly. I couldn't really see it there. But he had been apart from his mother for 21 years, and he was looking for her. And that's it's these ads that got me going, thinking about this book and about what separation was like for people.
What kind of records were kept by either the slave traders, the slave owners, the slave families?
I find bills of sale, but they're scattered, and so you might go to the archives and you find the papers of a prominent slaveholding family. And the more prominent they were, the more likely they were to have kept the records, and also I think the more likely their families were to pass them on to archives so that a historian can come and read them at this point. So you might find bills of sale that would list the name of the purchaser, the name of the seller, and usually a first name and a description of the person being purchased or sold. An age, sex, possibly a first name. So you get those kinds of documents. You get in planters' journals, some planters I've seen were really fastidious and just paid close attention to the detail of the operation of their plantations. And so every morning, this planter might come and write down how many bushels of corn he was giving to be fed to the hogs, how many rations were given to the enslaved people that week or that day. And they might have lists of families, enslaved people on the plantation, and often grouped by family, at least according to the mother, because the ownership of the children passed through the mother. And so that was the important thing. If you owned this woman, then any of her offspring belonged to you, despite whomever her, the father of the children may have belonged to. And so they might have those kinds of groupings. People might show up in a slave census, but usually not even by name, just by number, the number of people somebody owned. And so it's very, very hard to get this information. You get journals, diaries that planters kept, and that can be a really important source of information because they're talking about who they may have to sell or who they're planning to sell or who's run away, or they're talking about threats to their lives and confrontations with enslaved people or rumors of plots by enslaved people. And so you get some information in that way as well.
Professor Williams, were you surprised at the number of slaves that could read and write to put these ads?
Well, you know, I did, my first book was called Self-Taught, African American Education in Slavery and Freedom. And so I had spent many years working on a book about literacy. And again, I can never tell. W.B. Du Bois estimated that at the end of slavery, about 5% of people coming out of slavery were literate. But I don't really know where Du Bois got that number from. I cannot put a number to it. So I had written a book about people's deep desire for literacy during slavery, and I explore lots of the reasons they wanted to have it. One reason was to be able to write a pass, because as an African American, whether you were enslaved or free, you needed written permission to move about the landscape in the South. And so people wanted to learn how to read and write, to be able to write a pass, to forge a pass. Frederick Douglass gives us the text of the pass that he wrote when he escaped. And so I knew that some people were literate, but I had not really, what surprised me was that people were using their literacy to find family members, to track them down during slavery and then after slavery. And so when I see an ad written that was placed by Thornton Copeland, I'm not positive that Thornton Copeland wrote the ad himself. I don't know if he's literate. That's all I know about Thornton Copeland is what he tells me in that ad. So he may have been literate, or the editor of the newspaper, the Colored Tennessean, could have written it, so he may have dictated it. But I was very surprised to see that so many people were using their literacy to write letters, to search for family members, both during slavery and after.
From your book, Obadiah Fields lived in Rockingham, North Carolina, but spent much of his time on the road, purchasing people in Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina for sale in South Carolina. He corresponded with his wife Jane during these trips, informing her of the progress of business and expressing his love for her and their 4 children. It is evident that intellectually and emotionally he kept the slaves he sold and the family he loved in very separate spaces. Quote, "Loving wife," he wrote, "this will inform you of where I am at this time. I am well. I have sold all but 4 Negroes. I shall leave this place also to hunt a market for the balance of the Negroes I have on hand. This is my sales of what I have sold." And then he goes on to list what he sold. Rachel, $400. Stephen, $525. Henry, $525. Carrie and children, $675. Amy, $300, etc.
Right. And I found those documents in an archive, and the archivist said, there was an archivist note that said, these documents aren't very helpful except possibly to ascertain the price of slaves at this particular time. However, when I read the document, this particular document you just read from, what I saw was the kind of compartmentalization that I think slave owners and